Gonna jump in, or we're gonna wait?
I think you can go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, good afternoon officially, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this Engage webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Trina Shanks. I'm director of the community engagement team at the School of Social Work and a professor here. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm wearing glasses, a lavender dress, and multicolored sweater. I have curly black hair. I'm African American. I'm really excited about this conversation today. A note about accessibility: if you hit CC or closed captioning at the bottom and show subtitle, and on the right upper hand side, toggle between gallery and speaker view, you can just see the PowerPoint slide and who is talking, if that makes it easier for you to follow the conversation. Our session today will be exploring cisnormativity in the field of social work, through constructs of deviance, such as gender deviance work to serve oppressive systems, and how we might challenge these narratives and systems in our work. Students of the Engage mini course and panelists, please stay on after this session for a 30-minute debrief, and everyone else will let you know when the official session ends. Next slide, please. We always get started to take a moment for a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Engage is aware that we function in a society that has a deep history of exploitation, stealing both land and labor, and it's affected and shaped both our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. We want to acknowledge this in everything we do and work to create a more inclusive tomorrow. So I'm going to take a moment for you to read this land and labor acknowledgement. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to introduce the Engage team right now. We have Sonia Harb, who's our Detroit engagement strategist. We have Aisha Ghazi Edwin, who's program manager and adjunct lecturer. And we have Fatima Salman, who is our Engage program manager. And then, of course, we have Parker, who is currently one of our field students and helped organize this whole session today. So we thank them for that. But on now I'm going to turn it over to Aisha, and I will allow you to take over for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Trina. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. I use the pronouns she and hers. I'm a South Asian American female. I have short black hair. I'm wearing a blue dress. We do that, by the way, as part of accessibility best practices so that it also is reflected in the transcript. Just want to name that. So as Dr. Shanks described, we have an awesome session today. It's going to be exploring cisnormativity in the field of social work practice through constructs of deviance, such as gender deviance work, and how it serves these oppressive systems, and how we also, as social workers, may be perpetuating the systems of oppression. This is meant to be an interactive session. This is a webinar format, so if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and we will save time and make some space at the end of the session to go through those questions. Again, reminder, if you're in the Engage mini course or if you're a panelist, please stay on for the extra 30 minutes so that we can debrief together. And now I want to really thank Parker, our Engage field intern, for putting this session together, for bringing these amazing speakers. And why don't I just hand it over to you and give you a chance to introduce yourselves and then help to introduce the panelists.
Yeah, totally. Thank you guys for that. So I'm Parker. I use he and they pronouns interchangeably. I am a white person with short black hair, silver glasses, and a black shirt and a gray shirt because I am very much a multiple shirts person. And like they said, I am an intern at the School of Social Work Engage. I am a student in my final semester in community change and interpersonal practice. And I am really honored and pleased to have all of our lovely panelists together here today. And so I would like to transition into asking you all to introduce yourselves. You can take 5 minutes or less to introduce yourself, your preferred pronouns, identifiers, organizations, and work. Really like whatever feels important to you and like what you're bringing into the space today. Please tell us about it. So I don't know if there's one person who wants to start, or if we want to go in like alphabetical order, you just let me know.
Shanna, do you want to go ahead first?
I was going to ask Isaac if it was quiet at the airport now and have them go if it's a good time, but if not, I can go first.
Okay, just because you're at the top of my screen. So
okay. All right, then here we go. Hi, I'm Dr. Shanna Katz-Katari. I use they, them pronouns, or my name is pronouns. You'll see a white non-binary femme with an undercut, red curly hair, cat's eye glasses, big purple earrings, and a burgundy floral dress with some visible tattoos in front of a room full of books and cat themed curtains, as well as a lot of trans and queer and disability and social justice artwork. Identifiers. Usually I have a list. I'm a white Jew witchy. I feel like I should also say anti-Zionist because of what's going on right now. Middle class, disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, fat, polyamorous, non-binary queer femme. I am a associate professor here in the School of Social Work, as well as jointly appointed in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and currently the director of the Sexuality, Relationship, and Gender Research Collective. So if you are interested in that, I'm going to just put in the chat, if you are ever interested in doing community engaged queer, trans, relationship, other such research. We're always excited to have community members, students, postdocs, faculty. We have folks, I think, in 5 or 6 countries now, so always excited to have folks on board. And the work I do straddles 3 areas. So I do work on disability and ableism. I do work on sexuality and sexual health, and I do work on queer and trans affirming practice, and that's both social work practice as well as healthcare practice. My background is a little different than some of the other social work folks on this call. I don't have a master's of social work. I have a master's of human sexuality education from Widener University. And so I spent and continue to spend a lot of time, almost 2 decades at this point, as a sexuality educator. I'm a board certified sexuality educator. I joke that I'm a professional pervert because I have those fancy titles. And then I ended up and found my way in social work. And so the work I do, the research I do is very community engaged. I also care deeply about teaching. I teach a queer and trans practice class. I've taught a trans specific practice class. I've developed our sexuality and social work class here, as well as I teach our doctoral students about pedagogy. So I'm excited today to talk. I know everybody's kind of talking in their own areas, but kind of my field is specifically around that I want to speak to is around trans folks and cisnormativity in everything from education and field to research specifically as compared to a specific area of practice. I'm also a cat person. I currently have 5, which is too many cats in case you're wondering. I inherited 2 of my mother's when she passed away this spring, so they're very loud sometimes, so I'll try to keep muted for that. I also identify very strongly as a bridge builder. I think that our systems need change that comes with explosions and, from the outside, and change that comes from metaphorical explosions, just because I feel like I need to be very clear with how things are being interpreted, as well as people on the inside, digging away at the mortar to pull the bricks apart. And I think that the field of social work needs that. I think our society needs that. And I identify very strongly as the person that helps those sides communicate. Similarly, between academia and community work, and how do we have that communication? You might guess that I'm an institutional boundary pusher, and I'm just going to own that at this point in my career. Thankful for tenure. Yeah, other than that, I'm just really excited to be here. And I am delighted to have gotten to be in space with Isaac and Beksoka in other ways. Dr. Keogh, sorry, I need to, formally recognize you've finished your degree. And I'm just really excited that we're having this conversation. So thank you so much to Parker for, putting this together and including us.
Might have a quiet moment, so I might jump in, but if that changes. Dr. Keogh, I'll just yield the floor. Good morning. I'm calling in from Phoenix this morning. I am at the airport, so I apologize for any background noise and distractions. I'll try to mute. I'll keep muted when I'm not talking for sure. And if you see me looking off camera, it's not that I'm not paying attention. But for someone with ADHD, there's a lot happening around me. But I'm here. I'm with you all. Yeah, so my name's Isaac Eketmetis. I use they, them pronouns. I am white. I had no hair left since starting the PhD program. I'm bald. I have glasses. I'm wearing a mask, and I'm wearing a black and red, very comfy plaid hoodie this morning. I am currently at Arizona State University as a doctoral student, and my area of research within social work is with trans and non-binary young adults. And I'll be hopefully going through the ropes here pretty soon to defend my proposal for my research coming up. So I'll be looking at how trans communities define safety outside of a carceral forced treatment model within mental health crises, and what the community really defines as being safe and affirming, and how and where they'd like to receive care, as well as exploring more around trans joy and the role of trans joy potentially in euphoria and supporting mental health among trans folks. I think sometimes our stories get pretty flattened, and there's so many dynamic pieces that I know will come out in this conversation today. I also have background in working in community with LGBTQ folks. I don't know if you can you hear that noise in the background, the announcement? A little bit. Okay.
Someone's boarding a flight.
Yeah. So I've done community work with LGBTQ youth in substance use prevention and suicide prevention. Field supervisor, I've taught classes, and I'm interested in macro and policy work as well. So hoping to contribute back to the conversation.
Awesome, hey, y'all. I'm Beksoka Gal. I go by Beksoka as a two-part first name, and I go by Dr. Gal in some instances in the face of white supremacy, but only when I feel like I have to. But usually I go by Beksoka. I am a brown person. I am Cambodian. I have dark brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and a dark green shirt. And I also am wearing a floral sleeve tattoo on my left arm. I work with currently at the Sustain Center as a research associate, and Sustain is at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. It's led by our fearless and wise center director, Dr. Samira Ali. And also shout out to my team at Sustain, who has been the most supportive and awesome team that I have ever worked with. We partner with community-based organizations and HIV service organizations to enhance trauma-informed care, harm reduction, mental health, and general wellness services in the context of HIV, and specifically focused in what's colonially known as the US South. Yeah, and so what we do is we provide funding, training, coaching in those areas with a primary focus on enhancing services for people living with HIV, and particularly communities that are most systematically impacted by HIV. My role currently is I do some research, I do public impact scholarship, and I co-lead a language justice opportunity with my colleague, Dr. Maria Wilson. Yeah, and I also wanted to acknowledge my family because I am who I am and how I am because of them for me. And so I come from a family that has experienced forced migration due to war and genocide, and that also showed me how to resist the systems of white supremacy, English dominance, and classism in the context of this land that we occupy.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your, oh, sorry, you had something else.
I was going to say that I'm going to have my screen off for the remaining session.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for letting us know. So yeah, thank you all of you for your introductions. And now we're just going to get into a little bit of background into like why this panel is happening, what we're talking about when we say beyond pronouns. So this panel came from my supervisor, Aisha. Thank you, Aisha. Granting me the ability to basically like help co-design one of the like consistent, we do a couple panels every semester. And I wanted to explore these questions today because trans exclusion in the field of social work generally is the norm. This isn't just a U of M problem, this is an everywhere problem. And I wanted to spend some time unpacking the reasons why and how this happens. I think one thing I want to, oh yeah, this one first. So like why cisnormativity? At the School of Social Work, we talk a lot about how academic jargon for the sake of academic jargon is unnecessary, isolating, inaccessible. But in that conversation, I also feel like we leave out a lot of words and terminologies, especially from the scholarship of marginalized people. Words that like aren't in the popular lexicon, but are definitely useful tools for teasing out ideas we don't really have other words for. So I wanted to frame this conversation by starting with an interrogation of normativity, because this idea of like quote unquote trans issues is usually portrayed as like, at least in the mainstream and in mainstream social work, being outside of what is considered normal society. And cisnormativity tells us that we are living in the same society and implies dynamics of power and complicity that are important to understanding why we're having these conversations in the first place. My hopes for this conversation, this isn't comprehensive. I hope this is just one discussion out of what I hope will be more at the School of Social Work. I know and appreciate a lot that people in the School of Social Work are already doing some of this work. And also, I don't really think it gets the recognition it deserves, and I want more for us. So I hope that this will be a prompt for our attendees to promote that and work toward doing more like stuff like this. A really quick note on content. Most of our virtual conversations usually include a lot of historical explanations, a lot of slides, a lot of statistics. Generally, I think this is really helpful to give people a nice primer. But given the state of things and just like being a trans person in the world, I didn't really feel like I wanted to go over all of the statistics about why things aren't great right now for like the 50th time, and you know, condensing the history of gender oppression into a couple of slides just like didn't feel like where I wanted to spend the time today. So I know you're probably used to that from other Engage panels, and that's not what we're going to have today. There are going to be a lot of resources I'm going to send out after the panels are over with the recording. So there will still be like plenty of places to find new information and expand knowledge. It just looks a little bit different today. So if we can go to the glossary slide again. So just like a really quick and dirty definitions. This is not meant to be, I would like to spend a little bit more time with all of these words, but I figured since these are probably some words that we're going to be using a little bit more that aren't always words that people are using in regular conversation, we would spend a little time talking about like what they mean. So deviance, sort of boiled down, is the fact or state of departing from usual or accepted standards. Hegemony is the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas. Oftentimes, I think another way that hegemony might be referred to is talking about master narratives. So that's another way that you might think about it. Cisnormativity is the assumption that everyone identifies as the gender they were assigned at birth, and those who do not are considered abnormal. Within cisnormativity, there's also a lot of expectations of particular gender performances, because we're always doing gender all the time. And transnormativity describes the specific framework to which transgender people's presentations and experiences of gender are held accountable. So going back to that idea of like performing gender, structures transgender experience, identification, and narratives into a hierarchy of legitimacy that is often dependent upon medical standards. So that's our quick little glossary. And then I just have one more thing to babble about before we get into discussion. If we can go to my, I think, third slide that I added. Cool. So in the spirit of challenging cisnormativity in social work, I would like to start by challenging something that I have been seeing a lot in the U of M School of Social Work specifically, which is a lot of professors and people generally, I think, often attempting to be using inclusive language, but sort of missing the mark. So saying things like women and women-identified people, male and male-identified people. When the active verb is identified, who is doing the identifying? And like, why are we saying there are standard women and then there are women-identified people? Like, what do you mean by that? So if you mean women, you can just say women. If you mean men, you can just say men. Something I notice a lot of people struggle with and stumble over a little bit is how to refer to gender marginalization as a whole. There is a really cool key term that was coined by a trans community member, MAGE, capital M, lowercase a, capital G, lowercase e. It stands for marginalized gender. So if you need to talk about gender marginalization and you want to refer with a big umbrella term to a whole group, you could just say people who experience gender marginalization, people of marginalized genders, marginalized genders. We don't need to do this dance around referring to biological sex in bioessentialist ways, or just attempting to do, you know what I mean. So we have more words. We love that. I apologize. I am a little anxious and stumbly right now, so thank you for bearing with me. I would also like to say as a final disclaimer that I do have resting sad face. I am not upset with anybody. I'm very glad to be here. I just look like that sometimes. And so with that, I would like to get into our first general question, which is, and anybody can answer this first if just like something is coming up and coming to mind, and we'll go from there. But how have you seen cisnormativity in social work, either in education and practice and research?
I can kick us off if folks feel okay with that. And again, I invite Dr. Gao and Isaac to, ping me if you have something, and I will quickly yield the floor. I also want to make a note on your note, right? Is that if you want to be clear that you are being trans inclusive, you can say something like women, trans women and cis women, right? Or, and in those spaces, I always try to include trans folks first, because we use, again, cis as this like automatic, like you're trans or you're normal. I mean, that's the whole idea of where the term cis came from, is to differentiate that. So, same thing. And then the other just note on language too, that, we spent so long training people on pronouns, and we still end up with preferred pronouns. And I want to make very clear that people's pronouns are their pronouns, and see, even if all we get to at that point is, using people's correct pronouns, they're their correct pronouns. And when we say things like preferred, that's indicating that it's optional, and it's not. So I just appreciate these notes around languages, and ways that we can be more inclusive. And I think, when we say cisnormativity, gender, and what we mean by gender is actually the sex assigned at birth is what we're usually talking about for people, because we don't actually care that much about people's gender in our society, unfortunately, is baked into every aspect of our lives, right? So, you know, when I do these talks on gender, you know, I'm like, where do you enter your gender markers? Right. And it's everywhere from insurance, including car insurance, and what you, you know, what gender you list or what gender is clearly on your documentation changes how much your car insurance is. It's on your, when it comes to education, it's on your FAFSA. And we've run into issues, especially historically, with trans people being barred in the military, or you know, in our society, men have to register for selective service, and you can't get financial aid unless you're registered for selective service. However, if you are a man who's transgender or of trans experience and all of your documentation says M, you're like, okay, I guess I legally have to register for selective service. But also the military doesn't really want trans people, and historically has banned trans people. Similarly, if you are a woman of trans experience, you might have registered for selective service prior to living as your authentic self. But then it's complicated because women in our society aren't supposed to register for selective service. So even something as simple as accessing financial aid to be able to get into social work programs is really complicated. You know, using correct names and pronouns on applications for all of these things. You know, some schools have this way that you can display your correct name, but if you get paid, for example, it comes under your dead name or your birth name. And that's actually something we've run into a lot with community engaged research, is that when we're trying to pay community partners who have, you know, joined our research teams, you know, I have to have them fill out an I-9 and, you know, fill out these vendor forms, and all of those have to be under their legal names. And so they're getting, you know, all of this information from the university sent to a name that's not authentic for them, and that can be really activating and triggering. And there's currently no system for us to work around in that, right? So even something as, you know, quote, simple as community engaged research can actively be harmful to the people we're trying to work with to support and affirm, simply by the way that the financial system is cisnormative. We see it in research generally. You know, the quintessential binary variable that they teach about in statistics is sex, right? They usually say gender, and they're like, gender, male, female. Well, first of all, male, female is sex, and it's also not binary. We have lots of our intersex siblings that are an important part of this conversation. But what they're usually meaning is the gender that you live your life as, which is also not binary. And so in how we talk about statistics and how we collect research is often done in this very binary way. And so, you know, not even counting non-binary and gender expansive folks, if you're a person of trans experience, you have to decide, like, do they want what my actual gender is, or are they trying to use this as a stand-in for sex assigned at birth, especially when it comes to sexuality and gender research. But then there's entire swaths of people whose experience disappears, either because they choose to participate in the research and they select based on sex assigned at birth or the sex that they get read as the most, or they just choose, in my case, I just don't take those surveys, right? Or I choose not to engage in those studies. And so then people are like, well, we didn't have that many trans people, or we didn't have that many non-binary people. But simply the way that we look at gender when we're trying to collect this information eliminates so many members of our community. So we see it a lot in research, and you know, I went my first year here to the NIH National Institutes for Health Disparities Research Institute. And at the time, there were 6 of us that did what they would qualify as sexual and gender minority research in a room full of 50 people. And we had all of these conversations about how to collect race in you know, the most effective way, and how to collect income without asking income for a stand-in for income. You know, and I pointed out, you know, they're like, use education as a stand-in for income. But with the trans community, we tend to be and underemployed because of cisnormativity and transphobia. So you can't use that as a stand-in. But when I brought that up, they were like, oh, well, that's just a special population for whom this is different. And at no point in this whole talk, we talked about country of origin, we talked about all these different ways you could collect things. But in addition to not talking about disability, we also didn't talk about sexual orientation or gender identity. So you have this room full of incredible emerging scholars who are doing meaningful research around marginalized communities. And they were like, cool, so the 6 of you can collect gender and sexual orientation in a meaningful way, but no one else in this room should be able to know how to do that, even though of course everyone in the room should know how to collect race in a meaningful way, right? Which also the cisnormativity then starts upholding that white supremacy of, oh, well, like white people do that stuff. White people have marginalized genders. White people are the ones who have trans experience and are, having all of these things. And so, in research, the way that this plays out is like the trans people do their research over here, and the folks of color and racialized folks do their research over here. And we don't recognize that there's like a huge intersection between those communities. So that's a little how it shows up in research. And within education, I will say I often have faculty that connect me with trans and gender diverse students. I have those students who find me themselves. I spend a lot of time on calls with students, with the field office especially. But this shows up, cisnormativity in classrooms, not only with stuff around pronouns and students being incorrectly pronouned and misgendered, which is a form of violence and is very harmful, but also, for example, in how we talk about the DSM. And there's some deep gender essentialism in the DSM, and most of our faculty, not just here, but I've talked with folks across the US at least, are not prepared to have these conversations around like, oh, we're talking about alcohol and substance use disorders. What does this mean when this says for women it's this and for men it's this, right? We don't talk about like if you are getting your client into mental health treatment or substance use treatment or a domestic violence or shelter after a case of intimate partner violence, like how do you know which shelters are going to be trans inclusive and affirming, right? Like that's not centered in it. It's mostly like, oh, well, when you have one of those clients, you should figure that out, rather than, wow, like let's talk about the fact, in your class on violence, that our violence support, our shelters that support survivors are not designed for trans people or men for that matter. Right. And these folks can all experience violence, and trans folks experience extraordinarily high rates of IPV. So it's really relegated back onto these practitioners, and our students at the time of like, if that happens, when that happens, you'll cross that bridge when you come to it, rather than talking about like our field should be leading in ensuring that these folks are centered in our work. And I also see it in folks in their field placements who really struggle with finding field placements sometimes that have gender included in their non-discrimination statement, or they'll include gender in the non-discrimination statement, but then they'll show up and there's no gender inclusive bathrooms, or they show up and the intake forms there are very gender essentialist, or in the case of some students, their field instructors have told them like, I'm not going to tell our community clients to make sure to use the correct pronouns for you. Like we'll use those for you as staff, but we're not going to use those or your correct name for you, as, we can't ask our families to do that. And so then students have to decide between doing a field placement that does the work that they care about and want to do, or doing a field placement where their basic humanity is going to be recognized. And that's a really, and then it's also like, do I switch my field placement? So I have lots of other thoughts about this, but I want to make sure everybody else gets their thoughts in too. So those are just some of the ways that I see cisnormativity playing out in social work. Oh, and of course, the accrediting of all of these mostly religious programs at small schools that where people have to sign something that says that they're not homosexual or transgender in order to enter the program or be faculty. And that's a whole other conversation. But when we talk about cisnormativity, the fact that we are not like radically against this as a field is a way that cisnormativity plays out. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think something that I want to add to that really resonates with me and is in other environments and situations that I've been in, where it's like, this is like an organization that is interested in community, and they like to use the word the community a lot, is that there is like this marked difference in how they see the community that they're working with and the people that are doing the working at the nonprofit organization. And I feel like it is really disrespectful to really push forward this idea that there like aren't trans people in the community, or that like community members that you're working with have never met trans people or never met queer people, or that I just feel like often like at the School of Social Work, people push this idea that if you are a multiply marginalized person, especially if you're poor, you just like don't have the capacity to like learn about certain things. And it's clear like you could never have like had the access to know that like queer people exist or any queer people in your community. And that is usually rooted in classist and racist stereotypes about like your community members. And I think it's really important to challenge that. So thank you so much for that. Are there other panelists that want to respond to either some of the things that was said or the initial question? Whatever is cool. I just want to hear your thoughts.
Hey, I have a response to the original question. Thank you, Shanna, for sharing about the systemic, impact of cisnormativity in education and how that shows up in the classroom and in field, which at the University of Houston we refer to as practicum. In terms of how cisnormativity, from my experience, shows up in like the educational landscape, is that there are folks, with the best intentions, but not the best impact in the classroom, who are teaching or mentoring or both, that turn to cisnormative resources and content, which shapes the classroom setting. It shapes the language that students use when they show up to practice with community or in organizations. In practicum, it shapes the approaches to practice, so just not the language, but also how you do, how you practice what you're learning, right? And it shows up also with for the practitioners, right? Or practitioners who are learning, show up with these cisnormative and often white supremacist frameworks around gender and transness. And then that, gets implemented throughout the social work community, but also impacts the community's access to equitable healthcare, mental health services, etc. And then also I wanted to make a note about practicum or field, and how there are also organizations that are focused on LGBTQ mental health, healthcare services, that also operate from a pretty cisnormative lens. And so I've worked with students who have experienced misgendering at these types of organizations as well, who that also have assumptions about gender without a with that are also racist, I guess. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, I appreciate this. This is a question about what social work is responsible and what our imperative is around changing the culture within social work, and really addressing it from education to practicum to research to service, all of it. And as I hear you all talking and think about it, just like the labor that goes into trying to change these systems individually, and sort of the toll of the daily decision, is this going to right? And so then I think conversation like this and collective work makes it a lot easier to engage in. I started my master's program just as I was transitioning. I moved from Florida to Texas to go to school, and decided like it was a good time for me to sort of inhabit my authentic self. But it also made for some interesting challenges of being in my own field practicum and transitioning through my first year. I was in a high school. My students were great. I had a supportive supervisor, and my practicum professor. We're still connected 10 years later. So I had really great supports, which I was surprised about a lot by Texas, and that's about where the support ended. But those people were very important for my own survival and support within the program, because there's things like, yeah, you can't have your name, and at the time we were in Blackboard instead of maybe you're in Canvas now or some other virtual system. My birth name, my dead name was showing up in Blackboard. So I was automatically outed to my class. And then IT was able to figure it out where they could give me an alias, but my name would still be showing up. So then there's like this other person floating in the classroom. And I have a pretty unique last name. So like you can put together who that is. And so it took a while to finally get IT to be able to change it. And our school had previously, you could change the gender marker, but not your name. And I thought that was so strange. Like I feel like the gender marker would have been a little bit easier or a little bit harder to do. But it was one of those, like, the right staff got together and kind of changed it without a lot of fanfare and notice, like a process for this. And so I'd like go up to the registrar and be like, I need to change my gender here. And she was, cool about it. But the name took a couple of years to get that changed. And then in the placement that I had in the school, every day I had to print out a sticker for my name. My driver's license, or for a year, 3 days a week, I had to go and print out a sticker with my legal name on it and cross that out and write Isaac. And it's just one of those little things that's just like, I'm just trying to get into my office. I'm just trying to meet with my students. My students were incredible. I got missed a lot. That was the thing, like Mr. Out of being polite, and I'd have conversations and they'd be like, oh, cool. So anyway, this is what happened in my day. And so I found that like my clients were, for the most part, it was fine. Oftentimes I find it's the adults, it's the practitioner. So it's Shannon, I think you're talking like practitioners will wait until a trans person walks in, or and then we'll figure it out, right? You'll wait to figure it out then. Sorry. And I wondered sometimes too, when you're talking, you can't house trans clients because you have to think about the safety of the clients. There's also always this assumption of violence on the part of the trans client perpetrating violence against the other clients and the client's discomfort, instead of the safety and concern and care for the trans client. So it's like on us then to figure out what's safe, and then that message being reinforced that we're not safe, we're not welcome. And so it's sort of these macro and micro questions that sort of chip away. And so I think that really made it important for me to want to stay in social work and be able to give back to students. And so I have really, really enjoyed being a field supervisor. And I was a field supervisor in a placement that was a community prevention program within a larger mental health system. And we were an LGBTQ specific program. And there was one of two placements in all of Phoenix, I think, that was LGBTQ specific. So I often got queer and trans. And it just become, as I'm sure y'all have experienced, that extra time in mentoring and getting to know students, and in addition to the social work practice, really working with them in their development as LGBTQ social workers. How do they navigate their own transition or their own coming out? And doing that in the middle of an organization that was at times affirming and at times was not affirming. And it was always a learning experience. And so definitely had a lot of opportunities to engage in that way. And as part of our role at community prevention was also providing education to providers. And we couldn't get past the conversations about pronouns, right? Like, it's LGBTQ101. It's convincing people, just getting practitioners to understand like LGBTQ people are deserving of care, because it is just, it's a special population, it's a small population. We're often left out of studies because the sample size is too big. There's just less information, and it seems like it's still okay for social work practitioners to say, I don't want to work with that population. I'm never going to work with LGBT folks, or maybe they'll get supervision around it, but maybe they won't. And so that also we've had definitely some positive moments where practitioners came around and had conversations, and created that safe space. But that also starts to wear on you. So I think some of us like move in and out of these spaces to figure out what fills our cup, what fight we want to fight that day, where we can contribute. And then sometimes need to disengage totally for self-preservation. So it'd be nice if social work as a community, as a practice, as a CSWE, ASWP, NASW, they all have a roles where the social work, Society for Social Work Research, Council for Social Work Education, all have a role in really making sure that that message is loud and clear, that non-binary folks are here, that we're important, that policies are making it pretty challenging just to live and exist, and that we have a social work imperative, whether or not you abide by the NASW Code of Ethics, to fight back against that policy and make sure we're setting the needs of our queer and trans clients. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. I think Aisha has a quick question.
Yeah, no, I want to thank all of you for just talking about your experience, right? And how you feel like it's how both the School of Social Work, all schools of social work, and our profession has been exclusionary to both trans identities, gender expansive identities. And, you know, in these sessions in the past, we've talked a lot about how social work historically has held up and even perpetuated racism, right? Like often social workers will come and they'll be the ones that will take away kids from predominantly Black and brown parents. And now there has been this national onslaught of policies that are attacking trans individuals. And like, for example, Governor Abbott saying, if you know about parents providing gender affirming healthcare to their children, like you can begin a CPS case against them. Can you all talk about how you've seen, I mean, social workers are the one kind of perpetuating that, right? They're the ones that have to uphold those discriminatory policies. How do we fight back against that? And what do we do so that we're actually working in alignment with our values and our code of ethics? Because that's definitely not in alignment with our code of ethics. There's a lot of information in that question, but I wanted to bring it up and see what all of your thoughts are.
Yeah, my initial thoughts. Thank you for asking that question. How to fight back, resist, respond, I would say first is with community, alongside community, following community's leads, particularly folks in the community who are experiencing like the compounding stigmas that are proliferating because of the rhetoric and because of these very public discussions and policies. Yeah, I mean, my practice area currently isn't with children and families or youth and families. It's with organizations. And one way that that's shown up in our practice with organizations is the slowing down of resources that go out to community. And because of anti-trans or cisnormative ideas that are very much so embedded in the US South, and including systematically, and also racist policies that are also being advanced here too. Yeah, and so it definitely impacts access to resources, to community. We had an experience where someone, a university administrator, said that our program excludes white people. And so we were expected to like, you know, start all over basically with the process. And yeah, so in response to that, I worked with my team and my co-lead to figure out what the priorities were, and we wanted to prioritize community, right, in that moment. And so we gathered folks that we were working with, let them know about what was happening, to practice transparency, and also share about how systemic racism and cisnormativity are showing up in even organizational work that we're doing. And yeah, making a decision to prioritize community to receive funding as soon as possible.
Thank you. And that's really helpful. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Just to add a little bit from what I've seen around advocacy around specifically around like the weaponization of social workers against trans families, and Exoka, thank you for sharing on your side kind of those kinds of movements. I've seen the local NASW chapters be more vocal and step up around actions. So I think the year before Abbott's directive for trans social workers in Texas to investigate families, they were also trying to change the Board of Behavioral Health Examiners rules to basically allow, I believe, for conversion therapy or discrimination. They wanted to change that to make, if you're a social worker and you're perpetuating discrimination against LGBTQ folks, that would be okay. And the social workers in Texas really stood up to that and pushed back. And it's concerning when the legislature or other government officials that have an agenda can change your rules, because for licensed social workers, that's really what is the motivator. That's what people are beholden to. It has to be a licensure for infraction. So things like conversion therapy have to be framed in a way that's like unprofessional conduct and things like that. So I was pleased to see people step up. I wasn't there. I did not see how social workers, specifically on VCS, once that directive came out, but I do think like we have to be able to say like this goes against our professional ethics. This is immoral. Just because it's legal doesn't make it right. And to tie it back, as Joachim said too, it's larger movements to recognize that these systems have been weaponized against communities for a long time. And it took me a long time to learn that as a white person, just how disparate that impact is, especially with VCS. And I know there's always this, the stereotypes, and people don't like social workers because they're going to come take your kids away, but to really understand just like how that is used to break apart families. And so now I really try to carry that frame as well in thinking about the trans policy that we're seeing. It's horrific. It's stopping children and families from accessing care. And I think about too all of the families and children that already didn't have access to care before that, regardless of policy, but due to resources already, or not being in a place where you have affirming providers with intersections of other violence and discrimination and oppression. So I think it's really that much more important to have those broader conversations about these systems don't work for a lot of people. And so if we just address the policy and make sure that care is intact, we also have to make sure everyone's accessing that care, and then making sure that those that are most vulnerable, that don't have the resources to cross state lines to go get healthcare, to go get an abortion or whatever people need, right? Their basic healthcare needs. That's not an option for everyone. Just pick up and move. So yeah, I hope that social workers can step up more in that way and get creative with mutual aid, community support. And then if anyone has an answer, I've been really conflicted about putting together resource lists or things like that, because I worry about it getting into the wrong hands, having all the information collected in one place. So social workers, we need to have we need to learn how to network better and be able to reach communities in a way that that same information can't be used against the people that we're supporting.
So I just want to echo, yes to everything that both of you all said. And, I think social workers and just individuals often don't realize how much power they have individually to show up in spaces, whether that is showing up at your local school board meeting and talking about what books they're trying to ban, or if they are putting a policy in place where trans kids can't use their correct names or whatever it is, because they are absolutely being bombarded by anti-trans people. The anti-trans movement is very well funded. It's very well organized, as most conservative movements have been, right? Like they know how to do that really well. And so what that means is that when we feel frozen or we don't know what to do and we don't do anything, is that those are the voices that are heard and the voices that are centered and make up this small minority of people who genuinely believe that there's something wrong with being trans, become what sounds like a very vocal majority, even when that's not the case. And so, I really invite folks to whatever it looks like, so know what's going on locally, reach out to your, because it's not even just about gender affirming care, it's about the banning of books in libraries and of schools where trans folks and especially trans kids can't see themselves, and where cis kids can't see that trans folks are part of everyday narrative, right? Like that just perpetuates that. So libraries and school boards. I tell my students this all the time: when you graduate, you're going to have those fancy letters behind your name, and you might be like, yeah, whatever, it's a LLSW or LMSW, but like, to other people, that carries a lot of power. And anyone, literally anyone, is allowed to go testify at the state capitol on behalf or against any bills that come forward. And so to go up and to say, like, as a social worker, this is against our values and our ethics, and here's how this applies in my practice, right? And whether or not you've seen trans people in your practice, you should know how it applies. And so bringing this into advocacy space. If you're a social media person, great. If you're a mutual aid person, work on those networks. What Isaac was just saying. We have gender refugees who are able to move. We have gender refugees who are not and are either stuck in or want to continue to be in the states that are their homes but can no longer access care. So knowing those resources, being connected, so when someone comes to you and says, like, hey, do you know if there's someone that's going to be more friendly to this issue? Or do you know if there's someone that's willing to like work with and affirm my kid, whatever it takes. I really want to echo that it's become so scary and dangerous for trans folks, and especially trans folks who are racialized, and trans folks who are disabled and racialized, disabled trans folks, and all of these intersections. And I often have people reach out and they're like, yeah, I see things are scary, like what should we do? And I'm like, something, honestly, anything. Because I just got an email this morning from a very conservative website that wants to report on the queer sex ed event I did this past Monday, and how, like, why I feel that's appropriate, a queer and trans sex ed event, why would that's appropriate on a college campus. And other people, and so I've been doxxed before, which is where people publish my home information and address, as a dangerous person who's supporting, people use the term all the time, the castration of trans young people, right? They wouldn't use the term trans, but the castration of children and all of this. And the rhetoric is getting more and more violent. And I will remind folks that there is there's never been a reported case of a trans person attacking someone in the bathroom, but there have been many, many cases of trans people being attacked in the bathroom, and so whether it's about bathrooms or about pronouns or about gender affirming care, honestly, it doesn't matter what the issue is, because they're just going to keep coming. Is how do you show your clients, your communities, and also like in your personal life, right? Because I don't think you can pause ethics at the door of your home. Your friends and family, like, how do you show them that you're a person that's not just going to like offer thoughts and prayers, but that's actually doing work to make your community safer, whether at the policy advocacy, the individual action, the organizing, all of these different levels. So I just would really invite you all to think now about steps that you can take over the next 3 to 6 months or a year out or further to really push back on cisnormativity in your practice, but also in our communities, because without co-conspirators and accomplices, it's a very lonely, very isolating, and very scary time for many of our folks.
Thank you, Shannon. I just wanted to quickly say, thank you all for just acknowledging like the power that we have in these roles and the need to use it. So I'm a city council member here in Ann Arbor. One of the first things I did when I got in is I was approached by an organization and they were talking how essentially conversion therapy was allowed in Ann Arbor. So we worked together. I worked with colleagues and we put a ban in place. And that's a small piece of doing something or anything, but Dr. Hu, I think what you said about like you need to be connected to the communities and you need to find out what they need is just so important. So thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you all for your contributions to that question. Something that this conversation is bringing up for me is the ways that these like restrictions on like being able to change your name on an ID or having to, report your sex assigned at birth to your like automotive insurance or like other things of that nature. And also the legislation that we're seeing where people are being reported to CPS for supporting their trans children are the ways that all of these restrictions are connected to sort of propping up a surveillance state and how that affects, oh God, I lost it. I'm so sorry. But yeah, propping up and just adding, oh God, sorry. I'm having a little trouble with words today.
Take a breath, center yourself, and then return.
Thank you so much. But yeah, anyway, I've been thinking a lot about how these restrictions, that's what I wanted to get to. Thank you. Work to manufacture consent for restrictions on movement and expression and so many other things that also are disproportionately criminalizing poor people, people of color, and like how that sort of like operates in the matrix of cisnormativity. So if we have reflections on that, that's great. If we want to move on to another question, that's also lovely too. Thank you for listening.
I just want to name, like, they're all connected, right? Like, none of this is by accident. That challenges on reproductive access, reproductive care access is happening. Challenges on, they use the term critical race theory, but that's totally not what they're actually banning. Critical race theory is a very legalistic theory. They're using that as a stand-in for like talking about, the basic history of racism and white supremacy in this country. The don't say gay, you can't honor these kids in these ways, no gender affirming care, right? Like these are all tied in because white supremacy and ableism and cishet patriarchy they all support one another and they all come from the same place, right? So I just, I don't have a lot of like brilliant things to say, but I just want to name that like it's not by accident that these are all happening at the same time. They're all absolutely intrinsically linked.
Yes, and they're reinforced, right, by the documentation part that you talk about, like making sure like you got your driver's license, your birth certificate, all these forms of ID, all these places that you have to register information, and it's like it's not legal. It doesn't count until it's like Facebook official. Like it doesn't count until you got these documents changed, and they're always putting roadblocks up to make sure you can't change those documents or get undone. And it's I love the idea of having a non-binary marker, and then like I'm not. What are the implications, of that? Or trying to go get documents changed, and we don't. I don't know. I don't tend to define my identity based on what's on paper. It's going to be reinforced that there's assumptions automatically built in once I get to the airport today, whether I set off the machine or not, and the body scanner, right? Based on if whatever they see me and think should be lighting up on a different part of the machine. It's also like another level of creepy surveillance. And if you decline that, then you have to have a cut down, like all these things, right? And all these places we have to prove ourselves. And, it's like coming at it from this place of deception instead of, I don't know, celebrating how kind of cool and amazing it is that we get the opportunity to define ourselves and live authentically. And I wish, there was more of that celebration and honoring and of gender. And there is, right? Outside of a very Western colonial white supremacist based perspective around gender. And so it's like it just becomes this very government legal formal thing instead of more expression and fluid. That's kind of, as you both are talking, like what's coming to mind.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also know, Dr. Gao, you wanted to talk a little bit about your experience teaching in primary practice with community-based and HIV service organizations. And I would really love to hear about how you're feeling this is relating to the conversations that we're having today, if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Can you remind me of the question?
Yeah, it was just about how you're thinking about how your work with organizations, teaching and in your primary practice area with community-based and HIV service organizations, what you're feeling coming up in this conversation in relation to that.
In relation to the I'm sorry, in relation to what?
No, that's totally okay. I was unrelated to the previous part, like the most previous recent part of our conversation. I should have segued better into that. I apologize. Does that make more sense or no?
I have some thoughts, but yeah, it's so Isaac mentioned, and I don't know that this is the time for that, but what came up for me was when Isaac said or talked about like celebrating, being who we are and the freedom that brings. But I think that may be planned for another time, so I can pause.
No, I'm totally happy to get into that, please.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so in terms of my experience at Sustain, which, to provide a little more context, we partner with a lot of trans-led organizations in the US South. I think at the moment 26 and hopefully growing. And one way that we prioritize like the celebration of trans community and non-binary folks, gender non-conforming folks, is to prioritize resources specifically for joy and celebration and healing. And so yeah, something that we've recently been working on are our spaces that that the community is centered in virtually and in person. And then in terms of teaching, the history and the context is important around white supremacy and how that informs interacts with cisnormativity and how that is embedded in our society, and also intentionally making space in the classroom for trans joy and liberation and highlighting the successes of community members, particularly Black and Brown folks, is something that I find very important to be mindful of in the classroom and also in our practices with organizations.
thank you so much for that. That's making me think about a comment from a contribution from a potential panelist who wasn't able to be here with us today, who was talking about how when trans issues are treated as their own exclusive special topics, we talked about earlier how it's like, well, I'm probably not going to encounter a trans person, so I don't really need to learn anything about that. That also causes like one intersection of violence to be focused on, and usually flattens and minimizes things into just like the white experience of transness, and specifically the negative experiences of that white people have with transness, as opposed to like the expansive amount of experiences that people in trans community have that are violent at times, and also include a lot of joy and community building and other things outside of the two extremes of joy and violence. And so I really appreciate that. And I'm wondering how our other two panelists are thinking about making space for supporting, building room for trans joy, and how you see that happen in your practice. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, this is something also I'm always like mindful of, as well as like my experience as a white non-binary trans masc. I'm like, am I just trying to be like tactical positivity over here? Because my experience is very different. And I have been privileged and fortunate, but I think that the idea of joy is resistance, and not to ignore or diminish or minimize the painful experiences that we have in violence. I think there's room kind of for all of it. When I was doing my substance use suicide prevention work with LGBTQ youth directly, a lot of the programs are still kind of like the dare days where the drugs are bad, this is what your brain looks like on drugs, and blah, blah. And I'm like, can we talk to your kids about like what's getting them there? What consider maybe why they might choose to use or choose not to use, their resources for that. So part of the program that we created was like doing things like, if you were to design a pride flag that represents you, what would that look like? It looked like sharing about the history of the trans flag, which was created by Monica Helms, who lived in Phoenix, and the trans flag was flown in Phoenix for the first time. And seeing like youth in town see that and their eyes light up to think like, I have a piece of history here. That's where I'm based now. Like they didn't know that, and it was so meaningful that to them to think like, oh, there's more to this place that I'm living in than just what I'm hearing at the legislature. So I think like counteracting and making sure that our young people, that everyone like knows some of these pieces of resistance and history, which is why it's intentionally being banned. And right, you don't want people, it's dangerous, right? When people know their history and their connections and the power that they have. So we got to ban those books. We can't let them see that there's a way to be joyful or prideful or happy. And with parents, I try to work with parents around seeing and joy in the journey. For them to get to see for parents to get to see that how important it is to support their child in their journey. I think parents, sometimes a negative reaction to coming out is very fear-based, and understand their whole perception of their child has changed. But that can lead to like, I'm going to restrict their transition because I don't want them to be hurt. So being able to see how it can be a joyful journey, I think is important, or that they can find joy and support and love. Dr. Kataria, I'll turn it over to you now.
No worries. I was actually trying to, there's a new short on Disney, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, about a two-spirit person and a jingle dress and being gifted there. Like, anyways, it's just this really beautiful piece. And if anybody knows the name, please feel free to drop it in the chat. But I was thinking, in teaching our content, it's often really challenging because we teach on mental health and we're like, oh, trans people, 41%, attempt suicide in their lifetime. And I'm like, you know what, people should know this number, but let's also talk about why, right? Like, where is this coming from? It's from living with transphobia. It's from living at the intersection of transphobia and racism, or living at the intersection of transphobia and xenophobia, and all of this. And I was thinking about, historically teaching about Two-Spirit folks is my choice is like a 2-minute video or 3-minute video from YouTube, or this great documentary Two-Spirit, but that like literally reenacts the death of a Two-Spirit individual, which is like traumatizing for everyone, but especially gender diverse folks, and especially Native and Two-Spirit folks. So like, I obviously don't use that. And it was so joyous. A bunch of people sent it to me on Instagram, and then a bunch of friends were like, oh my gosh, it's on Disney, like, let's all watch this. And it was just, I think about, and this comes out of critical race theory actually, is this idea of counter narratives. And how do we push back against this idea that like, it's called, sorry, my friend was just texting me, it's called The Roof, is the name of the short. So I encourage you to watch it if you get the chance. But what does it look like, not just to necessarily talk about only trans joy, right? Because just like everybody else, trans folks and gender diverse folks have challenges with everything, right? Like, yes, there is substance use challenges, yes, there is experiences of violence, and if that's the only narrative that we get around trans folks, it's like, to quote Daria, it's the sick, sad world. And there is also so much just diversity within the trans and gender expansive community, right? Like, even here, I was like, oh, cool, we've got a non-binary dream team. And even in presentation, we have kind of, a spectrum of how we present, some diversity in how we use pronouns. It's all of these, nuances. And so how do we not have, if we're teaching, like that one, the trans case study that exists, right? There's a whole book of queer and trans case studies, as well as that's been published, as well as the work that we've done individually as professors or instructors who are teaching this. As practitioners, what does the artwork on your wall look like? Like, can you buy pieces that celebrate, if you want the history pieces, let's put up Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnston and, Wewa, and all of these different people that have come before us. If you're doing a trivia night for a local youth group, like, drop some trans and queer inclusive trivia there. Like, folks don't realize that the first organized gay rights movement was like in the 1860s in Germany, right? People think it's such a modern thing, so drop some of like that knowledge. Jane Addams, oh my gosh, most queer folks will tell you that Jane Addams was queer, right? Not necessarily the language she would have used, but was in a long-term relationship with a woman. And we don't like share our history of social work and queerness. We think about it as this like very recent thing. And so, thinking about, if you're an educator, are you putting trans people on your syllabi, and not just to talk about negative things, but pieces on trans mutual aid, pieces on, trans affirming practice. All of these should be on every syllabus, not just in queer and trans classes, and not just this really negative thing. If you're having movie nights, feature things that include trans folks, and trans folks not as these like Dallas Buyers Club, again, this sick, sad, all these negative things happen to us. But also things that experience trans joy. The new series of Heartbreak High has a Black non-binary performer who plays a Black non-binary character, and not, and their struggles at times are detailed, but also so is their joy and their relationships and their beauty. And so whether it's, again, personally or professionally, in the classroom and field or in your practice, give a three-dimensional understanding of transness rather than this, here's all the negative things that happen, because that's not helpful for anyone. And it's really hard as a trans person if even the people that you're learning from or that are supposed to be supporting you believe or only buy into this narrative that your life is going to be really negative. I know very few trans people and gender diverse people that regret living as their authentic selves, because there is so much beauty and joy in this world, and it can be much more easily accessed even in the face of transphobia when you are who you are. And so if we can capture more of that and less of the here's a checklist of what we need to talk about, I think that will also shift at least our field's perspective in a less cisnormative way. Maybe that's a Pollyanna statement, but that's my hope.
No, I like that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Shannon, are you gonna say something? Oh, yeah, speaking of checklists, like cisnormativity is very much tied to the history of pathology towards community and checklists or standards that have been developed based off of this history of whiteness and transness that is then implemented across systems of care and services. And so I just wanted to name that too as a part of the work to be done, and the resistance that's needed to disentangle systems and institutions of pathology and check boxes and standards, quote unquote, based off of whiteness, elitism, racism, and cisnormativity under the guise of healthcare.
I'm going to chime in one more time because that, if that's okay, I know we're reaching, and I think the end of our time. I don't want to take up too much, but something that I tell my students, and all students and practitioners that come to talk to me that are like, I have a trans client, they need a letter for their practice, and like, yes, we should be absolutely moving hormones, and I would also argue gender affirming surgical care towards an informed consent model, because that's the model we use for literally every other type of care, right? I got my COVID booster, and flu shot, don't do those at the same time, the other day, right? And all I had to do was sign that I knew what the risks were, shot, done, right? And this is true for my knee surgeries, my hip surgeries, my hysterectomy, because I'm read as a cis woman, right? Like all of these things, I just have to sign something. But for trans people, we ask them to jump through these hoops. So if you, as a practitioner, are asked to write a letter for a trans or gender diverse person to access care, please excuse my language, but just write the damn letter. Write the damn letter. There are books out there. This is a book that actually Isaac has a chapter in, but this is Social Work and Healthcare Practice with Transgender and Non-Binary Individuals and Communities, Voices for Equity, Inclusion, and Resilience. And there is a chapter that gives you an example of how to write the letter. There's even a little activity around it. There are many examples of letters that exist out and about. Not writing the letter is transphobic and causes irreparable harm to that person, who then now has to go pay to find someone else and build a relationship to do that. So if you are seeing a trans person and they're like, listen, I need a letter in order to access this basic care, write the damn letter. And I know this in some spaces is seen as radical, but honestly, like that's the only ethical thing I think that people can do. And I just wanted to name that too.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jana. I didn't mean to send a message that, we shouldn't be writing letters or anything like that.
Oh, no. Mine was just on top of that of like, yes, dismantle the system. And while we're waiting, write the letter.
Got it. Yes. Yeah, my intention was to share a perspective around, or at least wonder if there are more equitable ways to write letters or to, access care as we're moving toward informed consent everywhere, considering the context and the circumstances that each of us are in each locality. And then
thank you all for those reflections. I think something that is coming up for me in this conversation of like trans joy and in general, like how to show up for trans clients, trans communities, trans people in your life. It is not a thing, I don't think, but it feels in the same sort of family to me as a term in disability justice that I think Mia Mingus coined, which is access intimacy. As a trans disabled person, I often see the access intimacy I experience as a disabled person and the access intimacy I experience as a trans person as like sort of interlocking and as like very similar sensations. So I really appreciate all of that. Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I spoke over, so I can't hear anybody right now. Can people hear me?
This is Aisha. We can hear you. I'm also having connection issues, so my video is off, but I think you just froze for a second. So Dr. Cow, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you want to finish that thought?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, I know we're close to time, but one takeaway that I'd like to share around trans joy and partnering with community and organizations and clients and families is to remember that trans joy is not without Black trans liberation and anti-racist social work practice. Like all of that is important as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really sorry for interrupting you. I thought that you had paused for a little while, and that was not the case. So we're coming up on time now, and we do have a reflection in the Q&A that I just want to draw our attention to really quickly. And this person said that older cis adults tend to sexualize trans people, kids don't. I feel like that really speaks to the way that sexuality and specifically the ideas of deviant sexualities are weaponized to, punish and surveil trans people. And a lot of children haven't been exposed to those ideas yet. So they don't necessarily always think about criminalizing trans people in the same way that a lot of adults have been socialized to. So if we have any final reflections on that or final reflections generally, I just want to say thank you all for your contributions and sitting with us today. But yeah, do we have any last words?
This is Aisha. Oh, Shanna, do you want to go ahead?
My last word, I think sometimes people get in the weeds about like, I'm not going to do this right. I mean, this is the same true about being anti-racist and other forms of, anti-oppressive practice, right? And like, again, this is more of like a mindset change than it is a checklist that you have to go through. And so like when you start thinking about like what value do trans folks add to this world, what joy do they add to this world, what beauty do they add to this world, and like how can I center that? It's not a lot of extra work. We have to do like pulling apart and unlearning of things, but start by doing something, right? And the more that we feel frozen or that we have to do the right thing, whatever the right thing is, and I put that in quotation marks, it slows us down, and it makes the rest of us feel like nobody cares. So do something, and then go from there.
This is
I
Aisha.
appreciate that. Just like there's no one right way to be trans or non-binary or two-spirit, there's no one right way to participate in and encourage and support trans joy.
This is Isaac. I'm sorry, this is Aisha, not Isaac. Isaac, would you like to say something? That's also my son's name, so I got confused. Would you like to say something? Any like final last thoughts?
just gratitude for today, for this discussion, for being here. It's one piece of learning, and I think we all have our part to play. So thank you for Parker for organizing us, for everyone in this committee, and for the panel and all the participants. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. And if students of the engaged community class and some of the panelists could please stay on. Parker, again, thank you for organizing this. I think this is like, you know, we have to make space. We have to make space for these conversations. We have to make space for trans joy, we just have to make space. So this is the start of many conversations. And I want to thank you all for the work that you do. And do something, right? Do something. Oh, let me go to the last slide and just bring all of your attention to our next virtual discussion, which is the importance of transit equity. It's going to be on November 9th. So here is the RSVP link. We will be sending out resources that any of the panelists shared. If you didn't share any during the conversation, please feel free to email Parker and myself. We will send them out to everyone. Good plan word, Shanna. Love it. Thank you all.
So while we wrap up, I will be working with Aisha to move the students from the engaged class to panelist status so we can have a little class discussion for the last 30 minutes of this. And to people not in the class, thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you.